Hello and welcome to Get Into Nursing, brought to you by the Careers and Employability Service at the University of Greater Manchester. This session's for you if you are wondering how do you break into those nursing roles at Band 5 in the current climate of freezes and slowdowns in terms of job roles, looking at ways to strategize and optimize your opportunities, and looking at effective application and interview techniques and strategies to give yourself the best chance. So the main routes, quick guide to that. The most common typical route is the standard university degree. This needs to be NMC approved nursing degree and often takes place across those four key nursing branches, which is adult, children's, mental health, and learning disability nursing. This does qualify you for entry to Band 5 nursing roles. If perhaps you've already done a degree and have some relevant work experience within the care health field, you may be able to take a master's or a graduate entry accelerated program. That could be a postgraduate diploma, it could be a master's. For those that are going through a nursing associate route, it is possible to potentially top up to a full nursing degree after a period of work has taken place and obviously already been an NMC nursing associate registered. The final route is a degree apprenticeship. So what's actually currently happening, especially across the NHS with Band 5 nursing roles? Well, it is tighter, it's slower, and in many cases, trusts are actually frozen posts in the past year or two. There has been a slowdown generally in terms of the number of Band 5 nursing posts. However, it's not the situation across all trusts at all times. So there are pockets of work and there are pockets of opportunities. So it's really important to realise that is still happening across many trusts and making sure that you are in a position to see those positions and register for them and apply for them. There is a new measure which has been brought in by NHS England, which is the NHS Graduate Guarantee. So for those going through the university degree route, this is a scheme which aims to ensure that every newly qualified nurse or midwife in England has a genuine opportunity to move straight into a job. Now, there are caveats to this. Basically, every trust is encouraged to recruit proactively based on projected needs. So not actually what funded roles are there at the time. They can look at what they feel they need to have in terms of posts being secured. There is a guaranteed opportunity for a role. However, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be within your specific chosen trust or your specific area of interest. So you do need to open up opportunities in terms of being open to maybe trusts which are nearby to your current one, and maybe in departments or roles that you weren't originally thinking of, but perhaps there's lots of roles currently available in those areas. So elderly, acute, community typically have quite a lot of roles that come up. So it's about getting your inroad sometimes into a Band 5 role. And obviously they can be used to, once you're internally within a hospital or a community service, you can look at moving around later down the line. So it's worthwhile knowing that that's the current position. Okay. So what can you do? We touched on a couple of things there. So in terms of opening and increasing your options, look at your first options. There may be a number of fixed term Band 5 roles that are out there or time limited registered nurse roles to fill the gaps that have been created over the last 2, 3 years. You might want to consider that as getting an inroad into your first Band 5 post. Look at community trusts, mental health trusts, and smaller hospitals. They may not have the same visibility in terms of job roles, but they do have a range of readily available Band 5 roles. So you do need to make sure that you're tapping into that and seeing what is going on in those institutions as well. Whilst you're on placement, all placements this accounts for, not just final placement. Treat it as a potential interview almost for a future role. So do ask those key questions. Do they actually offer a graduate guarantee? Is that something which they are already projecting? What posts, Band 5 nursing posts, they're going to need in the near future? Make sure that you let them know that you are very interested in that. And if there are any future positions, if you could be on a list to be contacted. Request informal visits as well. So whilst you're actually on your placement, perhaps visits to other wards or specialist areas that interest you. Try and speak with the ward manager. Again, make that connection. Make the most of who you've actually got contact with whilst you're in these situations. It's always good to demonstrate what you're doing on top of your degree. And obviously, it's a very busy degree. You are doing 50% academic work, 50% placement time. It's very busy. But anything that you can demonstrate that has developed your knowledge, your skills, your interest, such as taking on online modules or additional training, professional training of any sort. Future NHS is a particularly good platform for this. That's always going to put you in a great position when you come to actually apply. Because one of the key things you've got to demonstrate is why you are such a good match for the role that you are applying to at the time. And these are very effective ways to try and demonstrate that. So, job search. Many of you, especially in your final year, will already have registered and set your filters and notifications on these sites, but perhaps not all of them. I would urge you to be doing this if you are in your earlier years on an undergraduate degree so that you get a good sense of what's happening out there. Anyway, okay. So NHS jobs, you've got your track jobs, you've got your NHS jobs site generally. For those that are looking for bank work, whilst perhaps still studying, there is the NHS professionals, where you can look at sort of more sessional based and bank based roles within health trusts. You've got some private sector sources that are well worth keeping in touch with and just keeping an eye on. You have a few there with nurses, BMJ. You've got the Royal College of Nursing jobs. I'd highly urge you to connect with them, along with their excellent career advice sections on their website as well. The RCN do some very, very good provision in terms of how do you effectively apply, interview, search for job roles. So do access that as well. And then you have other sectors. So you've got your charitable sector, things like charityjobs.com. You've got community care jobs. You've got local authority roles, which perhaps could have some interesting and varied roles for you to be looking at. Greater Jobs is a fantastic one if you're looking at Greater Manchester region, location. And then you've got your specific hospitals outside of the NHS. So you've got things like Bupa that run their own recruitment campaigns. Finally, recruitment agents and agencies can be worth a look at. Here's some of the more commonly known ones. So you have Pulse, Mayday, Nurse Plus. And again, I would urge you to probably join the Nursing Jobs UK website as well. So a wide range of potential vacancy searches. I would certainly urge you to make sure that you set your filters effectively and register on all of those sites that you see as being relevant. Obviously, NHS is an absolute must. Okay, so moving on into effective applications, how do you make sure once you are finding roles that you want to apply for that you are competing for those roles effectively? So first thing of all is research the organization. You do need to make sure that your application matches what they are looking for. So what skills, what knowledge, what experience are they saying is of importance or interest to them as an employer? You need to make sure that you know what they are and that you match those in your application. Okay. So when you see a person specification or job competency list, it sometimes is called, that is your guide to make sure that you use in your application form. So other key things, the career resources I mentioned, the RCN before, very, very good. They have great videos on effective application making. So I would suggest that you go there and have a look at those. Other things to bring into your application of value is anything that you have found out about that particular department or trust that you think's of importance or relevance or has a good match to you in any way. That's always added value. You can bring those things into your supporting statement of your application. The NHS core values. So the trust values, they will commonly be on the application process. So look for those, refer to them in your application, but also in your interview as well. They don't just put them there to look good. They typically utilize those values in the recruitment process. So take note of them and incorporate into your application and interview. Always keep a copy as well of any application that you do, especially the supporting information section. It's very easy to not get access to it again when it's an electronic application. So make sure anything that you do, do it on Word first. Then, when you have edited it and you're happy with it, then place it onto the application and then keep a copy. So here's a quick example of core values. They're commonly very similar, but each trust may have slight differences. So do try and get that information as well. They commonly will post it on their recruitment processes. So quick example of a person specification. This is just pulled off from the internet. It's not anything special, and it's certainly not anything that you can apply for right now. However, good to see that you typically will have these, especially for NHS related posts. So wherever you see a JD/PS link on your application process, that is your person specification. It's your job description, your person specification. If you don't find this, you will not get that post. You will not get to the next stage because it's highly unlikely you're going to match everything that's on here. And that's what you need to do. Okay. This prepares you for your application, but it also prepares you for your interview as well. So this is just a portion of the person specification in this case. It's a band 5 nurse. It tells you what qualifications, what experience, what knowledge, skills, and understanding they need to see from you. Examples embedded into your application. They will also design interview questions at the next stage that will hopefully bring out your examples of how you meet these same skills, knowledge, understanding, and experiences as well. Okay, so that is your guide. That is telling you what you need to do. When you start your supporting information, make sure that your first opening sentence, just make a short statement with a very quick summary of what you think you can bring that definitely meets this role in particular. The more specific you are, the stronger your statement is. Okay, so any information that you find out about this role, what you're getting from the job description, the person specification, core values, core experience, that's highly valued. That might well go into your opening statement. Okay, all right. The next sentence is we really do need to follow the person specification and make sure that you're providing examples of how, where, when you maybe have met those criteria points in the person specification. So for that reason, you need to break it down and decide what examples best fit the criteria points. And that might involve 2 or 3 criteria points in the person spec. You don't have to have a full example to every single criteria. But where you can see that you have had a very strong, relevant experience that meets a few of those criteria, make sure you put it into an experiential example. And the best way to do that is through the STAR technique. And there's a few varieties of this. There's STAR, there's STARE, there's all sorts of things. But essentially, it works very, very well in how to structure your supporting statement, but also your interview as well. So any time spent preparing these will not be wasted because it will get used in the application process for you. So when you give an example, you don't just say, yes, I have that skill, I have that knowledge experience, I worked in this sector, or I had this placement, therefore I've got this experience. That's nowhere near enough. So what you do is you break it down, you make it more specific. So where were you in the example that you are providing? What were you aiming to do, or what were you working towards? Then, most importantly, what actions did you take in the example that you are giving? And that's where you embed the skills, the knowledge, the experience that you're referring to from the person spec. You put it in the actions of your example. That way, the shortlister can clearly see what you're doing and that you are matching the person specification, which is what they are essentially grading everybody on. All right. So if you can use the keywords from the person spec points you are using in the actions, that is going to help you. And finally, the R of STAR is result, but think of it more as impact. It doesn't have to be a tangible result. It can be if you have one. So if you did finish a particular project and it had success or achievement of any way, yeah, that's great. Bring that in. If not, though, and it was more a case of how you helped improve a situation that you outlined at the beginning, or you have learned a new skill or a way to work that's more effective, that is also impact result. So think about what came from the actions that you provided in your example. That's what you put at the end. So quick recap. So for the interview and the application, but it works well for both this, you need to read any literature that you have already. If you can go that little bit further, do a bit more digging, find out maybe something further. Tools like LinkedIn, platforms like that are very useful. That can often bring in maybe specific key interests for you that you might want to bring into your interview or even your application process as well. Be aware of challenges that are facing the profession and make sure that you have an example of how you perhaps have become aware of those, where, how, and be prepared, especially in the interview process, for questions which ask for examples of how you've overcome challenges, perhaps whilst on placement or in hospital-based clinical work. If you want to have any additional help, support, preparation for interview and application for that matter, you can come and see us within the university, the careers service, and we can look at doing mock interviews, practice interviews. We can look at how do you start embedding your STAR examples into your application supporting statement. Then please do. We are available through Student Hub, And when you go on that platform, you will be able to see appointments and select what suits you. So you can take control over that and book yourself in for any type of appointment when it suits. Okay, final checklist really. So top tips. Um, Remember to always do your supporting statement in Word and save a copy, okay, before you transfer it to your online application. Always demonstrate how you meet all the essential criteria from the person specification. If they have a desirable criteria part to the person spec, then where you can potentially comment on it, where you have relatable experience or knowledge or understanding, make sure you do embed that as well. Okay. That is there because if they're struggling to shortlist, they go to desirable. So anybody who can maybe comment or give some example of how they might potentially meet some of the desirable, do that because it helps you become a lot more competitive for the role. It's not possible usually to have all those desirable ones. It's a bit of a wish list from the employer, but where you can do comment on it. Always use examples, even when not asked to give an example, give an example. So STAR method works the best in terms of structuring those examples. And remember, do try and demonstrate how you meet any of the organizational trust values or that particular trust that you're applying to their core values. It's always a very useful thing to bring in. We can always, as we say, read or help you, support you with your application recruitment process, your interview preparation. So do bear us in mind within the Careers and Employability Service. And finally, show, not tell, is the key point I want you to take away from here. Many times people don't get shortlisted or get the post that they've applied for simply because they've just said and told them, yes, I've got the skill, I've got the knowledge, I've got the awareness, but that's not going to get you through this. What will get you through is showing them, and showing them really means that you're giving them an experiential example of how, where, when. STAR is your friend when it comes to getting that across. And finally, just some of the key resources we have that you have access to on Student Hub, which is our career employability platform, is how to do CVs. You can have CV reviews, how to do applications, how to improve your LinkedIn profile and connections. We have all sorts of events, workshops that are constantly running throughout the year, the whole year. If you want reviews done on any of your applications or mock interviews, again, we will always offer those out for anybody who wishes to take that up. And we also have any interactive tools that you can really think of regarding recruitment. So assessment center tools, video interview tools, and many more. So please do bear that in mind and access at any time. It's always there for you. Final point, we do run drop-ins as well as appointments. We have a drop-in every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoons, and that's 1 till 5 o'clock. So feel free if you just want to have a chat and just catch up. You certainly can just drop in at any of those days' times. Thank you very much.